Okay, hi everyone, good evening. My name is Abby Kendall and I'm the Director of the Working Women's Centre. And tonight I'm going to be your facilitator for our online wage panel, Wage Theft in South Australia. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land of which I am located, and that is the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and those emerging, and I acknowledge the Centre is a not-for-profit organisation. That provides free industrial advice, information, representation to vulnerable, non-unionised workers, predominantly women with workplace issues. The Working Women's Centre is also engaged in research, education and training, and for the last 41 years, we've had a strong history at being at the forefront of law reform and social change for working people. This is the Centre's third webinar this year, and all of our sessions have been recorded. You can find our recordings and the other webinars and those recordings on our website, www.wwcsa.org.au, and soon enough tonight's webinar will be up there too. We're also streaming live on Facebook, and of course you have the option to ask questions throughout the webinar, which we'll be keeping an eye on and hopefully be able to ask our esteemed panellists your questions. So tonight we're going to hear from Ed Kavanagh, who's the Policy Manager at the McKell Institute, Australian Legislative Council, Angus Story, the Secretary of SA Unions, which is the peak trade union body in South Australia. Tonight's panel was put together in response to the recently published Wage Theft in South Australia Interim report, which was published by the South Australian Parliamentary Committee into Wage Theft, which of course Irene heads up. We'll chuck a link to that interim report in the chat box. That report, of which Irene is going to speak about tonight, tells us what we already knew at the Working Women's Centre, and that is that wage theft is in South Australia, but also across Australia, is an epidemic. Every day we have workers calling us to tell us that they are being paid anywhere between $6 and $15 an hour. And as we know, and you may know, the minimum hourly rate in Australia is $19.49 an hour. So this is incredibly low and of course unlawful. First we're going to have a chat to Ed. Ed Kavanagh joined the McKell Institute as a Manager of Policy in 2015. He has since authored major reports into economic inequality, trade, retirement adequacy, industrial relations, and more. Ed is the author of a series of major works on underpayment, including Ending Wage Theft, the economic impact of wage theft in South Australia, and the economic impact of wage theft in Queensland. Ed testified to the South Australian's Parliamentary inquiry into wage theft, presenting evidence of $500 million annual cost to South Australian workers to the committee. Welcome, Ed.
Hey, great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Thanks. So, Ed, at the Centre, we use your report a lot as a basis to say that wage theft is huge in South Australia, but in particular that it costs South Australian workers $500 million a year. Can you explain how you came to this figure?
Yeah, well, I'm glad the report's being used so effectively by you guys. Yeah, look, we've been thinking about this issue for quite some time, and we were looking around at, you know, what is the gap in the literature, and there's been so much great advocacy and storytelling done on behalf of victims of wage theft, and we really know the personal consequences of wage theft, but there's been a little less work done on that broader scale, really looking at what is this costing the economy overall and what's the aggregate impact. This is a really tricky thing to quantify because, you know, it's inherently under the surface and, you know, it is difficult to identify precisely what's going on. But the best data source that there is from the Fair Work Ombudsman's audit campaigns. And effectively, the Fair Work Ombudsman goes around randomly auditing businesses all across Australia. In the last 10 years in South Australia, there's been 23 specific audit campaigns focused on the state, and that covers about 1,700 individual businesses. So that provides enough of a data set to see how much underpayment is occurring within each industry. And we can use that as a base to extrapolate across the economy wide. And that's how we get to this pretty remarkable figure of, you know, almost certainly over $500 million every single year being taken out of the back pockets of workers in South Australia.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, I have known for a long time that this affects huge numbers of workers, but that $500 million figure just blew me away. So in your report, Ed, you talk about how wage theft disproportionately affects young workers, migrant workers, and women. Can you explain how the connection between wage theft and these groups of workers and why it's prevalent in those groups?
Yeah, it's a really important point. There are these key demographics and key industries where this is happening more than others. I think it's important to stress firstly, though, that this actually does happen completely throughout the economy. We've seen cases of wage theft in, journalism, the legal profession, places where people think things are going to be above board, but there are particular vulnerable groups, and that's been brought out by countless research, countless surveying. That, as you said, are typically migrant workers, international students, backpackers, and the like. Young workers generally, who typically have pretty insecure work and don't know a great deal, perhaps, about the rights that they're entitled to in the workplace. And then, unfortunately, I think female workers, and particularly younger female workers, often experience power imbalance in the workplace. So, fundamentally, what's going on and what stitches together all of these different groups is just this power imbalance, this often an asymmetry of information. The business owner knows, how to kind of raw a system perhaps when the employer might not know all of the facts about their rights and obligations, I guess. But effectively what's happening here is these are the key groups that are, exposed to a power imbalance. We also know that there's certain industries where this is happening more. So horticulture and agriculture, hospitality, these are places where migrant workers, younger workers, female workers dominate. So this is effectively why these groups are kind of, I guess, together. And that's what we focus on a lot when we're talking about this issue.
Yeah, right. And we've just got a question here. And that, just to be clear, that $500 million is $500 million a year, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's $500 million pretty much every year. And there's been some similar work done by some of the major consulting firms like PwC who found similar figures looking at a national level. So there's a growing evidence base that demonstrates just how significant this is becoming.
Yeah, right. And so we often think about wage theft as just impacting workers. And of course, it does in a way that we should think and consider about very deeply. But inevitably, law-abiding employers lose out. I imagine that government revenue is lower than what it should be because of payroll tax and that sort of thing. So can you sort of explain to us how, in a holistic manner, how bad is wage theft for the economy?
Yeah, that's such an important point because people often think about this purely through the lens of the workers who are victims of it. That's absolutely the first priority and the first concern. We should be fundamentally worried when people aren't getting paid what they're entitled to. But can you just imagine, if you're a small business owner, particularly at this time when everything's crazy, and you're doing everything right to stay above board, and the guy next door is underpaying their staff. I mean, they're obviously undercutting you. That is just completely brazen, and I think it is, against the law. But it's really bad for competition. It's bad for all of the legitimate small businesses, medium businesses, big businesses that are trying to do the right thing. And we know that is the majority of the business community. There's broader costs as well. We have, aggregate demand and spending in the economy from this money being pulled out of people's back pockets. So there's so many more impacts than just the direct feeling on workers who are getting paid less than they should be getting paid. I mean, it's this really broad macro issue. So that's effectively what we're talking about here, this big economy-wide issue, not just those impacting their direct victims.
Yeah, and on the economy, Irene and the SA Parliamentary Committee has just released their interim report, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, and she's about to start consulting on her criminalisation of wage theft, which we'll get to soon. But in your view, do you think that wage theft or the addressing wage theft in South Australia can factor into our COVID recovery?
Yeah, this is an interesting. I think it's a really important time to be talking about this issue, because we're seeing a bit of a tendency by those who are opposed to any action on wage theft, to say, look, COVID-19 happened, the economy's in the tank. Now is not the time to be talking about it. We just need to do, jobs, and get people back into work and turn a blind eye to bad behaviour if it means, a better employment figure. I just completely reject that way of looking at things. I think we need to start thinking about, what is the economy after COVID-19 going to look like in South Australia and in Australia? Is it going to be this sort of crass, pale imitation of the system that we had before COVID-19, which had, wage theft rampant and insecure work and all of these challenges for just everyday workers? Or can we actually sit back right now and think about, look, what do we need to do better? What are the holes in our system that need to be plugged? Wage theft is clearly one of them. We can't afford to have $500 million being taken out of the economy every year through wage theft. Like, we cannot afford that. The small businesses that rely on local community spending cannot afford it. So now is the time to be talking about things like criminalising wage theft. Like, this is part of the recovery agenda. It has to be prioritised right now more so than perhaps any other time. So yeah, absolutely. I think when we're talking about recovery, let's put this on the agenda. Let's not put it in the too hard.
Great, we agree. And so we've just got another question from the audience, which is this person is asking about the vulnerability of international students in particular, and whether there are you can suggest any possible solutions around that. I know when we had a chat the other day, Ed, you were talking about that kind of reputational damage for Australia because of the wage theft. So yeah, I mean, what do you think about that? And can you explain what we were talking about the other day?
Look, I think so many young Australians are privileged enough to be able to travel all over the world and see a lot of the world, and I've certainly been fortunate to do that. Countless times you hear stories about the dodgy labour practices that are occurring in Australia from backpackers and the like who've worked here. There's an understanding that if you're an international student or you're on a working holiday visa, you're going to have to tough it up and stick out the 88 days of horticultural work and often get exploited to basically pay for the opportunity to spend a year or so in Australia. So that's a big problem. The way that our visa system works and basically creates huge risks for international students and also working holiday makers if they break their visa conditions and they fear they're going to get sent home. So there's all these things that I guess are in the visa system that I guess make it difficult for international students to avoid getting exploited. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a reputational damage problem here when people go home and they've had a terrible experience. They're obviously going to share that information, but there's fixes as well. We can adjust the visa system, I think, to make it fairer and easier for international students, working holiday makers, to have a fair crack when they're over here. Yeah,
we're representing a number of international students at the moment, and I think something that comes up over and over again is there's this sort of assumption about students that they are wealthy and that they can afford to, be underpaid because they're, sent here by their parents but I think actually what's happening is that people are paying, $50,000 in tuition. They're moving halfway across the world away from their family, and they're allowed to work 20 hours a week. What they should be paid is the Australian minimum wage. And often they're servicing personal loans to pay for their tuition, and they're servicing those loans through Australian wages. So it's an absolutely important factor in this issue. So I suppose when you started this report, I don't know what you thought the outcome would be, but were you surprised by your findings?
I mean, I'd love to say yes. I wish this was something that just popped out of nowhere and we had no idea it was going on, and then we get these sort of figures. But we know what the cause of this is effectively, and there's been political choices for close to a decade that have made the environment, our economic environment, more vulnerable to this type of exploitation. And Angus will speak about this, and these guys will speak about this, but 10, 15, 20 years ago, unions could go into workplaces and inspect books and, acted as a bit of oversight to potentially dodgy behaviour by that minority of employers. When the Abbott government came in, that was taken away from the unions, and effectively, you would have thought that the Fair Work Ombudsman after that might have, I guess, been given further resources to inspect more workplaces and to create more oversight, but they just weren't. So we're left with this situation where there's, no cop on the beat, where we have these problems around, visa conditions and the like I was mentioning that lead to this power imbalance between employers and workers. And, this is the logical outcome of that system, of that framework. So yeah, I wish I was surprised by these findings, but I'll be pleasantly surprised if there is no wage theft in the future, and hopefully bills and work like that Irene is doing is going to get us there at some point.
Yeah, and we just got a comment from Tracy Matthews, and she says, in my industry, it's not that students are considered wealthy, they are considered exploitable. Yeah. I think that's a good point. Thank you, Ed. That was wonderful. Please, chime in the chat and ask any questions along the way. But next, we're going to speak to Irene Nevmadakos. She's a member of the Legislative Council. Hi, Irene. How are you?
Hi. Good to be with you.
Great. So I'll tell everyone a little bit about you, Irene. Irene is the daughter and wife of working class migrants who came to this country seeking democracy and economic fairness. It's those values that have shaped her entire life. Irene believes the lack of circumstances that someone is born into should not be a barrier to access quality education. As a lawyer through to community advocacy, Irene has much to contribute on behalf of workers and progressive causes. Since her election in 2018, Irene has chaired the Wage Theft Committee, co-sponsored the Free Menstrual Hygiene Products Pilot Program Bill, and has been a strong advocate for abortion law reform and the decriminalisation of sex work. Irene, as a legislative councillor, will continue to advocate for those voices that are not always heard, and Irene is, of course, a very good friend of the Working Women's Centre. So welcome, Irene, and thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Irene, in 2018, you chaired the South Australian Parliamentary inquiry into wage theft, and you have just recently handed down the interim report, I think maybe a couple of weeks ago. You mentioned to me that throughout your career, you've always known that wage theft is a pervasive and dominating industrial issue and a dominating workers issue. Can you tell us a little bit about whether your view on the severity of wage theft has changed through this committee?
I think over time there have been changes that have impacted on the effects of wage theft. And harking back to Ed's points earlier, that with decreasing intervention in the workplace and ability to inspect and involve yourself in the workplace from a union perspective has had an impact. The right to inspect, the right of entry, those sorts of entitlements have been seriously eroded. But wage theft has always been a problem, even from my days as a union official, and that was a long time ago. There were many underpayment of wages cases, but the union were involved and assisted in that process where they became aware of it. As a review officer and a conciliation and arbitration officer in the Workers' Compensation Tribunal, one of the most heavily disputed areas was in the calculation of the workers' earnings, and what you were exposed to were various anomalies in terms of how people were paid, whether it was cash, whether it was in kind. There were a number of issues that impacted on how people received pay for the work that they did, and how to calculate that for compensation purposes. So it figured even in workers' compensation. And also as a solicitor, I had to deal with many underpayment of wages claims. It's been the focus of media the last couple of years, and we've had a lot of high-profile cases in terms of celebrity chefs, fast food areas and restaurants, supermarket chains. There's been a range that have been exposed in the media and promulgated in the media in terms of this is what's going on. We're talking about millions of dollars, whatever the case may be. So there's been that focus. And on the committee, we listened to those stories again. They were reinforced in a more individual way and in an organisational way. So we heard from families and individual workers. We heard from businesses. We heard from advocacy organisations. We heard from unions. The same story was coming through. What we were hearing, however, was the increasing escalation, and it had become the norm. It was rare to find cases where it wasn't occurring. So certainly we were alerted to the fact that it had become widespread. We were alerted to the fact that what was occurring was deliberate and opportunistic on the part of some employers, not all employers, because even the Fair Work Ombudsman audits that have been undertaken, not all employers are behaving in a malicious, opportunistic way, but a number are, and certainly it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise at all. It's just the scale of the theft. It's become a normalised way of conducting business. It's become a business model for some businesses, and it enables those businesses to gain a competitive advantage against other more law-abiding businesses. So it's not a surprise, it's just a shame that it's occurring to the extent it's systematic. There's no question. And I'd agree, it's epidemic proportions.
Yeah, and we've just had a question. So on that idea that it's affecting other employers and business owners in that it's undercutting them, I wonder, what do you think about this notion that the reason, I mean, we won't say, you know, in a restaurant, your food won't be as cheap if people are paying the minimum wage. What do you think about that?
Well, even the audits that have been done in the CBD by Fair Work, the same prices are being charged no matter where you're purchasing your food from, for example. That the same work practices are not uniform. So you have the same prices, same types of food being offered, but in some sectors and employment, they are gaining a profit advantage off the backs of employees and workers. Yep. So they're profiting more.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, that's why we're calling it theft, right? That's
exactly right.
The crux of it. So, okay, well, obviously wage theft is happening across the board, and we know from your interim report that wage theft is happening in an unregulated industries, or is dominating at least in those industries. Those industries are where generally, or a lot of the time, women and people of colour are working. So can you explain to us from the report and from your investigations, which industries are culprits for wage theft? And why do you think that these industries are so culpable?
Those workers, the worst forms of wage theft are those workers with disabilities, young people and migrant workers. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And within that migrant worker category, I would also add temporary visa holders and students who are in the country. The victims are overrepresented in hospitality and retail sectors, which is usually areas where you find young workers, where you find migrant workers, and where you find women workers. They're areas that are usually non-unionised or limited levels of unionisation. They often have a high proportion of females, women working in those areas. There are industries where you see a more casual workforce or casualisation of the workforce. So what you have is insecure work, casual work, unregulated or limited regulations in place are sort of breeding grounds, if you like, for want of wage theft. That does it, and they are. It's all pervasive. It's across the board, across industries. But certainly where you have insecure or casual work, there appear to be more opportunities there for that level of theft and exploitation.
Yeah. And Suzanne has just asked whether casualisation, in your view, or what did you find through the first half of your inquiry, was casualisation a factor that led to more wage theft?
Casualisation is one factor. I don't think you can see it in isolation. There are a number of factors operating. There's limited regulation, so there's not enough scrutiny occurring. There's limited intervention in terms of access to resources and assistance and support. There are young people who are out doing their first job, their first experience at work. So there are a multiplicity of factors operating, but the absence of systems, of regulations, is certainly impacting, and casualisation is one of those effects, if you like.
All right, well, it's a pretty terrible problem, really, and I think it's time to move on to what are we going to do about it as a collective, as a parliamentarian, as an economist and policymaker. I mean, you are about to consult on your wage theft bill, and this bill criminalises wage theft, and if passed, could result in employers who dishonestly steal wages facing up to 5 years in jail and a $300,000 fine. Why is the criminalisation of wage theft necessary?
I think I want to take a step back, if I might.
Of course.
The committee identified 3 overarching areas that required attention and action. And those 3 areas, and that's from the various submissions that we received, those 3 areas were, firstly, the need to create greater oversight and regulation. Secondly, the need for penalties and criminalisation of bad cases, deliberate cases of theft. And the third was streamlining court and tribunal processes and procedures for those pursuing underpayment claims. So you can't see any fix on this problem by just targeting one area. We have to target each and every area in terms of addressing the issue. Now, criminalisation and penalties is one component of a strategy for change. We have double standards that operate in our state and in our country when it comes to theft. If you were a worker caught with your hand in the till, you would lose your job, and you would also be potentially prosecuted by the police for that theft. We don't have the same standard when it comes to employers. So an employer who deliberately and opportunistically steals from their workers does not meet the same, the law doesn't apply to them in the same way. They are often free of any penalties and free of any criminalisation. Well, we need to stop having double standards. The laws are here for all of us, and they should apply to all of us. I think that's the first issue in terms of why criminalisation. Employer theft needs to be seen in the same way as any other theft. And employers should not be in a position to have their form of business operation and model that makes them make a risk judgment in terms of whether or not to be fraudulent where their employees are concerned and risk the possibility of not getting caught and being able to continue to function that way. The legislation acts as a deterrent. The legislation says this law applies across the board. If you maliciously and deliberately steal from your employees, you could face prosecution and penalty. and those penalties would be in the form of a monetary penalty and also probably some jail time. I suppose it's like any other rules that apply to everyone in the community. Road traffic rules. Now, most of us are law-abiding citizens and observe the road traffic rules. Some of us sometimes don't. There may be reasons why we don't. But if you don't obey the traffic laws, then you know that there are penalties in place, there are fines in place, and depending on the seriousness of your crime, there may be a criminal prosecution that occurs. Well, that law doesn't seem to be a problem. We all observe that law. Well, the same thing needs to apply in terms of the workplace. We need to have standards and rules and regulations that apply to all of us. And the employers are not exempt from that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I'm wondering, and I'm hopeful that your bill will pass and we will see criminalisation of wage theft in South Australia, just as they have passed it in Victoria. And I think they're contemplating this in Queensland. So if we criminalise wage theft and there's a penalty of either, up to 5 years of jail time or a $300,000 fine, who's investigating the crime? Is it SAPOL? Do they go out to, the local restaurant that's paying someone $8 an hour, investigate that? Or is it someone else, or is it a group of us? What do you think about that?
I think we all have a responsibility. I think all of us are players in this process, and all of us have a responsibility to ensure that the rules are followed and we all obey the rules. So in the first instance, at the moment, what occurs with wage theft is that the individual worker is the one that has to identify, first of all, that there's a problem, and then try and navigate their way through the process that currently exists to try and receive some sort of recourse to the theft. We need to shift away from the individual somewhat, although we all have responsibility, but community organisations can play a role. Unions have to play a role. We all have to play a role. In this bill, there is a role for an inspectorate, so that the inspectorate could be involved, and the police need to be involved, at least in the prosecution stage, if not the investigation stage. So we have to rely on the various resources that exist within our community and develop models that work, that enable cooperation and assistance between the various organisations and groups and individuals. But I don't think it's one group. It's not the responsibility of one group. Fair Work is meant to be a body that oversees this. They've audited very few businesses and firms, and those that they have audited, the statistics are alarming in terms of the level of non-compliance. You can't leave it to one individual or group. You need to have a more holistic approach, and you need to involve all the parties, all the stakeholders who are involved in this issue to look at how we progress the matter. And it's a work in progress, to be quite honest, in terms of how we go.
Yeah. I suspect that at least government has to make it a priority, and when government makes it a priority, generally funds flow from there, and so that people have the capacity, groups have the capacity to be able to do this work. Yeah, and so, I mean...
The problem is the government isn't making this a priority. We have a private member who's into a priority for some. Yeah. And it's certainly not a priority for government. And anything you introduce as a private member or in opposition generally, anything you introduce, if it's a money bill, we can't introduce an all-encompassing, comprehensive program as has been introduced in Victoria, with a well-funded inspectorate that is playing a role in that process. We don't have those resources until there's the government support for something like that.
Yeah.
That's one of the problems we've got.
Yeah. Oh, no, I absolutely see that. I think, I mean, obviously the inquiry, the report, all of us coming together today, continuing this discussion and trying to lobby to force priorities where we want it is so important. And so certainly from the Working Women's Centre's perspective, this is really just the beginning of our own lobbying work, because we see this day in, day out. I mean, we've recently had a client who is earning $6 an hour. That is, I mean, you know, there are arguments about the minimum wage not being a living wage, but $6 an hour, it's just not right. So in saying that, I mean, this issue is really important, Members Bill. You know, why is this, and it's your private Members Bill, why is this so important to you?
Well, it's important to me because I think the timing is an issue. We're going through a health and economic pandemic at the moment. It provides us with an opportunity. We know that wage theft is a problem. There are enough reports now and audits that have been done by Fair Work to identify that it is a problem. Timing-wise, it does provide us with an opportunity to reassess where we are going as a society, what we see as important core issues that need to be addressed. And wage theft is one of those issues. We need to focus on what's important when we finally, if we do, move out of the COVID pandemic, what sort of a society we want to see, how do we want to see our young people and our workers in hospitality and retail in various service industries treated as employees. This is a golden opportunity to actually have that discussion. This is the time you have those discussions, and it's an opportunity to redress a number of the imbalances that we are identifying, and all involved in this space are identifying as imbalances and inequalities. It is a golden opportunity to actually take a serious look and look at what sort of systemic and structural changes need to occur, as well as legislation, to address these issues. It's not enough to just say, oh, we're going through a pandemic at the moment, everything gets, as Ed mentioned earlier, everything gets pushed aside. This is the time to be discussing those issues. This is the time to be looking at what sort of a society we have and whether people's endeavours are valued and appropriately paid. And businesses are enabled to flourish without having to compete with their competitors who undercut and opportunistically exploit workers for their advantage. So there's a number of issues, but it's a good time to do it.
Hear, hear. Thank you so much, Irene. Wonderful to have you. So stay tuned, keep participating. Next we've got Angus Story, the Secretary of SA Unions, which is the peak union organisation in South Australia. Hey Angus, how are you?
Hi Abby, great to be here.
Thanks. So a little bit about Angus. He is the public person for SA unions. He appears before tribunals and parliamentary bodies and works with unions in responding to public issues, policy and legislative change. He has an extensive background in industrial relations and policy development with a focus on employment conditions, skill development, education and training, workplace planning, work health and safety, youth issues, and of course, wage theft. So he's worked in private sectors for unions and for government, and a lot of his time at the moment is spent campaigning on industrial, political and social issues, including wage theft. So Angus, thanks so much for being with us. It'd be great to, we're talking at the moment about coming together on this issue and campaigning and lobbying, and so I'm going to ask you a few questions about that. But first, we know that union members are paid more than non-union members, and that non-union members are more likely to be the victims of wage theft. So if this if you're a union member, you're unlikely to be the victim of wage theft. Why do you think unions should care about the issue of wage theft?
Well, look, it is true that union members earn, on average, about 10% more than non-union members. Generally speaking, their employment, on average, tends to be a bit more stable than non-union members. But the important thing about wage theft is that it's fairly pernicious across many industries. Just because you're a union member doesn't mean that you're immune from wage theft. All it means is that you've got someone in your corner and you've got the collective strength of other union members to back you in when you run into trouble. So it's not a guarantee. Being a union member puts you on a firm footing in the workplace, but a firm footing is only as firm as the slippery floor you're standing on. And if the boss down the road is paying non-union workers far less than your employer is, and if workers down the road are essentially undermining union workers by accepting lower wages, then you start to get into a spiral to the bottom. And that inevitably affects union members as much as it affects non-union members. It pulls the rug out from under all the work that unions do to try and improve workplace conditions. So we care generally because we care for unions care for workers, and their prime reason for existence is to stop the exploitation of workers. So we care for non-union and union members to that extent.
Yeah. If anyone on this webinar or anyone in our audience is not a union member, you can go to the ACTU website and find out who your union is, and you should sign up immediately. And if you need more information about that, you can contact the Working Women's Centre or alternatively the ACTU. So unions, community legal centres and law firms often try to do what we do at the Working Women's Centre, but you do not sue yourself out of a systemic inequality. What are some of the barriers unions come up against when trying to address wage theft through litigation?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I mean, in a lot of ways, our workplace laws are weak, and I might come back a bit later on to talk about how things once were in the workplace, because I think there's some lessons from our past about how we could improve it. But because the workplace laws are weak, employers know that their chance of getting caught abusing workplace laws is pretty low. And even if they do get caught, the consequences are also low. So that makes it hard for workers to stand up for their rights and to enforce existing conditions, let alone win new conditions. So while employers are able to avoid liability, that's a great impediment to the enforcement of those conditions. But there's also some problems, and Irene's hinted at those when she says there's a need to legislate around wage theft, because there's a common misconception that whether you're a union member or not, you can simply go to the Fair Work Commission, and if you show your pay slips, then someone's going to recover all your wages for you. Well, it simply doesn't happen like that. The only authority that can order the payments is a court. There's upfront filing fees of about $615 to get into the court system to try and recover wages. If the matter's that's if the matter's in the federal court. If it's in a circuit court, it's $1,290 plus setting down and daily hearing fees of about $735. So what worker who's been stung for a couple of $1,000s is going to be able to front up with those kind of amounts of money to chase down employers who won't cough up. And most of them know that they might get a bit of a lecture from a commission or a Fair Work Ombudsman ringing them up, but if they sit on their digs and just wait until someone goes through the court system to get their money back, 9.5 times out of 10, no one's going to go to that trouble.
Yeah. And I suppose often people talk about the industrial relations system as being complicated, and in fact, George Columbaris, you know, the famous chef from MasterChef, famously told Lee Sales that his multi-million-dollar empire was not able to navigate the industrial relations system, and that's why, you know, he ripped and stole millions of dollars of wages from his workers, while, you know, receiving $1 million paycheck on Channel 10. Do you think that the industrial relations system is too complicated? And is this what is leading to an accidental underpayment of wages?
Let me make a couple of points. Firstly, you know, when I started working for unions, there were more than 2,000 awards covering workers. I mean, that was complicated. We're now down to a couple of hundred. Most of the serious employment conditions are incorporated as national employment standards in federal legislation. And a lot of these jokers who grizzle about how complicated it are, and I'm talking about the Columbarises of this world, I'm talking about Coles and Bunnings and Woolworths and On the Run, and you can go on and on. These are big, very profitable companies with huge HR areas devoted to doing nothing but looking at how much is being paid. It's not a complicated system. Many of these companies can work out the intricacies of international tax law when it comes to tax evasion, but they can't work out how much to pay their own employees. Give me a break. And Columbaris, $7.8 million, he ripped his workers off. In the end, he got a fine. Fine was $200,000. That's less than 5% of the amount that he stole off his workers. That was the penalty. Now, you know, without jumping too far out into left field, the construction electrical and plumbing union was recently fined $435,000 for simply putting in some records to the Fair Work Ombudsman that were a bit late. They were a bit clumsy with the paperwork. Didn't cost anyone a cent, but that's the way this system is currently skewed against workers and favours employers.
And so you're talking about a little bit there, like what it used to be like in terms of there being, you know, over 2,000 awards, awards. And I'm wondering, you know, back in the day, unions had a statutory power to enter workplaces and demand to see wage records. So if you were a union official and this is my understanding, and the legal minimum wage, then you could go in there and say, show me your books. And that's just not the case anymore.
No, look, that's exactly right. I mean, prior to the Howard government, prior to 1996, awards contained provisions in them that allowed union officials, empowered them to go in and inspect pay records and enforce laws. Unions could go, could inspect the entire books of a business, including the salary records of all non-union members, because what the Commission said was, this is an important area of enforcing Commonwealth law. If we empower people to inspect books, it will make sure that the right wages are paid, and that's a good and desirable outcome for society. So in order that our awards, that is the Commission awards, are relevant and operate properly, it's important that unions have this power. Now, of those rights really set about making it very, very difficult for unions to get into workplaces, that resulted in a lesser capacity for unions to do it. We needed to establish that there was a prima facie case places. In other words, you had to say you had a bit of a case against employers before you even went in, and then you couldn't look at non-union member pay records. So it was certainly a step down. It made it much more difficult, and later governments, the Abbott government and so on, added further onerous requirements on union employers. They had to have right of entry permits. Effectively, the union official had to have their own bona fides as a person of good character. You had to prove you weren't a crook to go in and investigate the crook. So it had gone from the situation where you went in to enforce the law and catch the crooks to one where you as a union official were prima facie considered a bit of a crook unless you'd registered, you'd got your certificate, and that could be taken away at any stage. So that's the issue. It's an issue about how industrial law operates at present. Now, the ACTU, the unions, campaigned very strongly in the last election to try and get many of these issues changed. And we did have commitments from the Labor Party, which didn't win the election, to address many of these things, including, for example, recovering superannuation, currently done by the Australian Taxation Office if and when it gets around to it. But we had agreement to introduce laws which would have meant that if someone stole your superannuation, they would have to pay a penalty of double the amount that they'd stolen if they were caught out. Now that provides a real disincentive from stealing. So we're keen to continue with the challenge and push those things, but we've got a fair way to go, Abby.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about the criminalisation of wage theft, and you know that some political parties have made promises, but we can't always rely on politicians and on government to pass the laws that we need for change. And so I'm wondering, what other strategies can unions and activists use to address wage theft in South Australia? And just on that, I note that Jess in the chat is asking if there's any way to find out who these businesses are. And, you know, Jess doesn't want to support businesses who are stealing the workers' wages. So, okay, you know, what can we do?
Well, that's a very good question. Look, businesses steal because they want to make a profit. They steal because they think their competitors are stealing. They steal because they don't think they'll get caught. And if they do get caught, they won't get punished. They steal because they can. And their business model is based on wage theft. Now, the thing to remember about all businesses is that their success is ultimately based on their reputations. They must retain and expand their customers, their suppliers. They must retain the trust of their landlords and financiers. And nothing destroys reputations quicker than having your honesty called into question. So businesses stop thinking wage theft is such a good idea and such a good business model the first time there's a picket outside their business at the peak of their business activity. There's people out there with placards accusing them of theft. They stop thinking it's a good idea when their social media websites are filled with 100 people complaining about their wage theft practices. They stop thinking it's a good idea when customers boycott their businesses. They stop thinking it's a good idea when the Fair Work Ombudsman turns up to audit them, when the tax office knocks on the door and says, someone suggests that you mightn't be paying your workers, and oh, by the way, are you paying your tax? There's Revenue SA, there's Return to Work, there's Safe Work SA. I mean, there are a lot of other instrumentalities and parties with some. I'd like to think that if businesses take a poor attitude towards their workers, then their workers, in conjunction with unions and other activists, will try and make their life difficult and won't make it easy for them to go on with those practices. And in the end, they stop thinking it's such a good idea when the media and other businesses hold them up as an example of what not to do.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, on that, when George Columbaris was in the news for 3 years with all this wage theft stuff, I mean, did anyone go to his high-end restaurants? I think they closed down. It's a perfect example of the power of the individual's dollar. But also, you know, something that I do is when I look up a restaurant and I'm like trying to find it or whatever, I have a look at the Google reviews. And if the first review is bad food or whatever, I don't go. But if I saw that the first review was also, this restaurant pays their workers $13 an hour, I absolutely wouldn't go. So I wonder whether there's a bit of power in the comments as well.
Oh, I think I think there definitely is. I mean, these are measures available to individuals, and these are measures available to unions and activists to pursue. And I certainly don't put all my faith in the legal system, although the union movement does its little best to change that legal system for the benefit of working people. We exist in a real world. We've got to take what actions we can which are effective to get workers what they're entitled to. Yeah.
We can't litigate ourselves out of this mess. Thanks, Angus. Yeah, they're excellent suggestions and certainly food for thought. And hopefully, you know, some of our participants, and in particular the participants who are the audience members who have been underpaid themselves, might take you up on some of these ideas and, of course, join their union. So I guess I've sort of filtered 3 questions over the course of the night, but there is one that I wanted to ask sort of all of the panelists, and that was a question about slavery. And the question is, I'm just trying to find where, and I'll just do it from memory, but where if a worker can't walk away from their employment, in that they're being paid $12 an hour, they need that job to live. They need it to pay their rent, to eat, to live, and they can't walk away. Why are we calling that wage theft and not slavery? What do you think?
If you want. I mean, that's a very good question, and probably in the most extreme cases, and there's a case for that. And this issue of modern slavery is alive. There's been a bill passed in the federal parliament on modern slavery. People talk about it at a lot of state government levels as well. There's a lot of work done in the union movement and internationally to stamp this out from supply chains outside of Australia, and an acknowledgement that there are probably hundreds of people thousands of people in Australia in what we consider modern slavery. So in those extreme cases, I think there's a pretty legitimate case to use that term.
Yeah.
If I could just say, the Wage Theft Committee is continuing its work. One of the areas where we are working in is the area of slavery as well. And we are continuing our inquiry in that regard. But like Ed said, I mean, it is an issue, and in extreme cases, that's what it is, and it needs to be called out for what it is. I mean, we don't need to hide behind words.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Look, thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. I wonder whether we're a little bit over time, but I wonder whether there's still some time for the panelists to leave anything that they would like to say that they haven't yet, any parting comments. It'd be great to hear from you.
I'll just leave with this point. I think one of the reasons why I'm really motivated by this issue is it really cuts to kind of the heart of actually how we see ourselves as a country, and this idea about fair go and, you know, the Scott Morrison have a go, get a go type thing, right? The abuse of power that leads to wage theft is just so against the grain of how we actually see ourselves as a society and as an economy. And that's why it's just such a terrible aspect of our modern economy, and why we need to be talking about it right now as a sort of foundational change to make post-COVID. So that's why I think we're all motivated by this. It's a really core issue that really cuts against the promise, I think, that's been made to so many people that our economy should deliver for them.
Angus?
Look, perhaps I might leave you with this thought. I'm thinking about COVID-19. I'm thinking about what's going to happen over the next couple of years, and things are going to get really tough. There's already a cheer squad out there for further reductions in worker entitlements and conditions, and there'll be a lot of pressure on. So unions are actively compiling a campaign right now, which will be an active political campaign to make sure that people understand that hurting workers won't heal the economy. That'll be the message that we're putting out there. And one of the most encouraging things we've noticed recently is that people have now that we are in this together, and it's thrown up a group of heroes that you know, before this you wouldn't have thought of as heroes, and they are workers. They're frontline workers in retail, in hospitals, in every area of the workforce. Those that are on the front line are now considered heroes. So we'll be running this campaign on the basis that workers are heroes, and it's only they've got us through the pandemic thus far. It's their ability to spend that's keeping the economy going. And if you cut that away and you chip away at their conditions, you'll simply be destroying the economy. So there's a broad campaign to be fought that includes these issues of wage theft within it. But hurting workers won't heal the economy.
Thank you. Yeah, agreed. Irene?
I think it's all been said. I think we're all on the same page, and we're all interested in having a fairer and just society, and tackling the problem of wage theft is one of the ways where you can actually help make that happen. And we have to try different ways.
What's next on the with the wage theft bill? What can people expect?
Well, we've got a series of consultations lined up about the legislation. The first group that's coming through are employer groups that have been invited. Second group is various NGO, for want of a better word, but community advocacy and law society involved. We've also sent the bill off for opinion from the Law Society in terms of the drafting of the bill and how it will work out. And the last grouping is unions and organisations representing workers. So hopefully, once that consultation is completed, we will introduce the bill into Parliament.
Great. Looking forward to it. Okay. Thank you so much, Irene. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Angus. This was a really lively, punchy conversation. I think people have loved it. So we'll keep more of these coming. We are going to, this has obviously been recorded. We've been live streaming on Facebook, and you'll be able to find a copy of this recording on the Working Women's Centre website either later this week if we get our act together or maybe early next week. But yeah, thanks so much for tuning in and have a lovely
Thank you.
night.